It is July 1955. A new Premier has been in office for a matter of weeks. His name is Henry Bolte, and somewhere in a Melbourne office, a decision is taken that will wipe a city's trams off the map forever. The trams of Geelong will go. They will be replaced by buses, privately owned buses. The reason given is that the system is outdated and hopelessly inadequate. Now hold that thought, because 25 years earlier, when the State Electricity Authority bought this tramway, its own engineers inspected every inch of it. Their verdict? Very good condition. Track under 10 years old, rolling stock under 20, better than Ballarat, better than Bendigo. So here is the question that haunts this story. How do you kill something that was never broken? And who gets rich when a public service disappears? This is the story of Geelong's forgotten trams. Chapter 1. The Company from London. Let us start with the thing everyone forgets about the Geelong Trams. They were never really Geelong's. They belonged to a company on the other side of the world, an English firm registered in London, with the very grand name of the Melbourne Electric Supply Company Limited. Everyone just called it MESCO. And MESCO already had its hooks into Geelong, because it supplied the city's electric light from a coal-fired power station down on the waterfront, at the corner of Corio Terrace and Yarra Street. Here is the thing about Geelong at the turn of the century. It wanted trams badly. As far back as 1888, two rival companies had been formed to build them, with names so long they barely fit on the page. The Geelong Electric Light, Electric Motor, Electric Tram and Omnibus Company. Try saying that 3 times. And then the 1890s hit. The Great Depression of that decade flattened Victoria. The land boom collapsed. The banks fell over. And the tram dream died in the rubble, like so much else. So Geelong waited. It waited through the turn of the century. It waited while Melbourne built cable trams and the world moved on. And then, in 1906, the agitation started again. Councillors wrote letters. Ratepayers complained. The argument was simple and it was sound. A modern city moved people on rails, and Geelong, for all its wool wealth and its proud civic ambition, was still moving them on foot and by horse. And finally, in July of 1910, a deal was struck. MESCO would build the trams. MESCO would run the trams. In return, the company got a 30-year lease over the whole system. London set aside £50,000 for construction, a serious sum in those days, and the work began in December of 1910. The rails went down, the poles went up, the wire was strung between them, and the power to drive it all came from MESCO's own coal furnaces down on the waterfront. Think about what that means. The buses, the light, and now the trams of an entire Australian city, all controlled by shareholders in England who would likely never set foot in Geelong. A private company building a public service for private profit. It is a pattern worth remembering because it comes back at the very end of this story, wearing a different hat. And you know what? They built it properly. They built it to last, which is precisely what makes the way it ended so hard to forgive. Chapter 2. 14th of March, 1912. The 14th of March, 1912, was a day Geelong dressed up for. This was the day the trams opened, and a city that had waited the best part of 30 years was not going to let it pass quietly. There were bands, there were crowds in the streets, there were ribbons strung across the tracks at each municipal boundary, because Geelong in 1912 was not one council but several, and every mayor wanted his moment. The first tram out of the depot was car number 4, decked in flags and bunting. On board sat the dignitaries, the men in their stiff collars and their watch chains, the mayors of Geelong, of Newtown and Chilwell, of Geelong West. The tram rolled out, and at each boundary line a ribbon was cut, and the whole thing inched forward into a new age. Remember car number 4. We will come back to it. Hold that image of it, gleaming and garlanded, carrying the proudest men in the district through cheering streets. Because this same tram, this exact car, has an appointment with history 44 years from this morning. And it will not be a happy one. Now, for those of you who love the engineering, let us talk specifics, because specifics are everything. The system opened with 3 3/4 miles of track. Standard gauge, 4 foot 8.5 inches. The overhead wire carried 600 volts of direct current. The tram bodies were built by Duncan and Fraser of Adelaide, shipped across by rail and assembled right here in the Geelong depot, mounted on trucks made by the Brush Company of Loughborough, in England. 7 of these cars to start. Open combination cars, with tip-over seats and magnetic track brakes. Little wooden boxes on wheels that the locals would soon nickname butter boxes, for the simple reason that that is exactly what they looked like. Square little timber crates rattling along the rails. They were assembled by hand in the Geelong depot from parts railed in from Adelaide and shipped in from England, put together by local men on local ground. 2 routes opened that day. One ran out to Newtown. One ran to West Geelong. Short branches reached the railway station and the wharf, where the steamer left for Melbourne across the bay. A 4-track depot beside the power station kept the fleet, and the whole modest operation, 3 3/4 miles of it, was ready to carry a city into a new century. It does not sound like much. 3 3/4 miles, 7 little cars. But this was the day Geelong stopped being a big country town and started being a modern city. This was the day the future arrived on steel rails, and over the next 18 years, that future would spread across the whole city like a web of iron. Chapter 3. The Iron Web. Here is how you take over a city. Slowly, and then all at once. The Geelong network did not stay small for long. In November of 1913, the line pushed south, across to the Barwon River. In October of 1922 came the East Geelong line. Then Chilwell in September of 1927. Then, just a month later, in October of 1927, the big one. Belmont. They threw a new bridge across the Barwon River and ran the rails over it, opening up the whole south of the city. The growth kept coming. North Geelong, the industrial end, in July of 1928. Eastern Park, serving the football and the gardens and the new houses, in September of 1930. By the time the dust settled, Geelong had 11 3/4 miles of track and a fleet of 27 single truck tram cars. The whole city was wired. From Belmont in the south to North Geelong, from the Newtown Hill to the eastern beaches, you could go almost anywhere that mattered on a tram. And they were clever about it too. At night, each route showed a different combination of coloured lights on the front of the tram, so you could tell your line coming through the dark from a block away. Newtown showed green, West showed red, East showed blue, Belmont showed white, North showed red and white together. It was a code the whole city learned to read without thinking. In the mid-1920s, the company brought in 8 big new cars built by A. Pengelly and Company of Adelaide, 35 feet long, with the elegant raised clerestory roofs of the era. Here is a small fact that should make any Australian engineering enthusiast sit up. Those Pengelly cars were the last clerestory roofed trams ever built in this country, the very last of their kind. At the heart of it all sat the depot, down on Corio Terrace, beside the power station and the offices. This was the beating heart of the system, the place where the cars came home each night, where the fitters and the foremen kept the whole fragile machine alive. The men who worked there knew every car by its number, every rattle and groan in the fleet. One of those depot men would, in time, become the foreman. He would be the one still standing there at the very end, on the last day, holding the bell. But that is getting ahead of ourselves. By the 1930s, the trams were not just transport. They were the bloodstream of Geelong. Chapter 4. The toast racks and the footy crowds. You want to know what a thing means to a city? Watch what happens on a hot Saturday. Picture a Geelong summer in the 1930s. The temperature is climbing into the 30s. And down at the depot, they roll out the open cars. The crossbench cars, with their slatted timber seats running side to side and no walls at all, so the sea breeze blew straight through. Toast racks, people called them, because that is exactly what they looked like. Open to the air, packed with families heading for the water. Because the trams went to the beach. Down to Eastern Beach, where Geelong swam and courted and cooled off. The tram would be jammed with kids in woolen bathers, mothers with picnic baskets, the whole carriage smelling of salt and sunshine and hot oiled timber. You could hang off the running board and feel the breeze and watch the bay come up to meet you. And the trams went to the football. This is Geelong we are talking about. The Cats. On match day, the cars to Corio Oval ran heavy with men in scarves, the conductor squeezing down the aisle with his leather bag and his bell punch, clipping tickets, calling the stops, the roar of the crowd and the clang of the tram bell, all part of the same Saturday. This was a working system in a working city. Geelong was the second largest city in Victoria, a place of wool stores and factories and proud civic ambition. And the tram was how it moved. To work in the morning, home at night, to the beach in summer and the footy in winter, and the shops on Moorabool Street any day of the week. The conductor knew the regulars knew the conductor. The whole thing ran on a kind of shared civic memory, a city that moved together on rails it had waited 30 years to get, and it reached almost everywhere that mattered. You could take a tram from Belmont in the south, across the Barwon, all the way through the centre and out to North Geelong. You could ride from the Newtown Hill down to the water. Through routing linked the lines, so a single car might run Belmont to north, or Chilwell to east, threading the suburbs together. The coloured lights on the dash told you which was yours before you could read the destination board. Green for Newtown, white for Belmont, glowing through the dusk. By the early 1940s, the system was carrying enormous numbers. We will get to the exact figure, because it is genuinely staggering, and it lands hardest in the chapter where it should have saved them. The point is this. By now, nobody in Geelong could imagine the city without its trams. They had been there since before the Great War. Your parents had courted on them. You had ridden them to school. They were simply part of what Geelong was, as fixed and permanent as the Barwon River or the You-Yangs on the horizon. Permanent. Now there is a dangerous word because somewhere in the machinery of government, the trams had a different label attached to them. Not permanent, not beloved, just a line in a ledger. And ledgers, it turns out, do not care what a city loves. Chapter 5. The Survey That Damns Them All. Now, pay attention to this chapter, because everything that comes later hangs on it. In 1930, ownership of the Geelong Trams changed hands. The State Electricity Commission of Victoria, the SEC, the great public power body set up in the 1920s, and first chaired by the famous General Sir John Monash, took over the operations of Mesco. The deal took effect on the 31st of August, 1930. And along with the Geelong system, the SEC inherited the tramways of Ballarat and Bendigo at the same time. So the SEC did the sensible thing. It sent its people out to survey what it had just bought, to check the state of the track, the cars, the overhead, to find out, in plain terms, what kind of condition these three country tramways were in. And here is what they found in Geelong. Here are the words that should be carved into the wall of every council chamber in this country. Very good condition. The Geelong system, the SEC found, was in genuinely good shape. Most of its track was less than 10 years old. All of its rolling stock was less than 20 years old. And, crucially, it was in noticeably better condition than the Ballarat and Bendigo systems the SEC took over on the very same day. Sit with that. In 1930, by the official judgment of the very organisation that would later kill it, the Geelong Tramway was the healthiest of the three Victorian country systems. Now, here is the part that will make you grind your teeth. Of those three systems, judged the best of the bunch in 1930, which one was destroyed first? Which one was wiped out completely, with not a single tram and not a single rail left behind? Geelong. The healthiest one. Gone first and gone completely. Ballarat ran its trams until 1971, Bendigo until 1972. And both of those cities, judged in worse shape back in 1930, kept their trams running for another decade and a half, and then saved them. You can ride a heritage tram in Ballarat today. You can ride one in Bendigo. The two systems the SEC thought were the rough ones survived. The one it called very good condition did not. The Depression years were not kind, of course. Passenger numbers sagged in the 1930s, and from 1932, the SEC brought in one-man operation to save money, the driver taking the fares himself. Belt tightening. Fair enough. But the bones of the system were sound. The engineers had said so themselves. Remember that. Because in 25 years, a man who never inspected a single inch of that track is going to call it hopelessly inadequate. And he is going to be believed. Chapter 6. The War That Saved Them. If you want to see how much a city needs its trams, take away everyone's petrol. That is exactly what the Second World War did. From 1940, fuel was rationed. Private cars went up on blocks and garages all over Geelong, useless without petrol to run them. And suddenly the tram, that supposedly old-fashioned thing on its fixed rails, was the most valuable transport in the city. The numbers tell the story. And what a number it is. In 1943, at the height of the war, the Geelong tramways carried 6.5 million passengers in a single year. 6.5 million. In a city of around 50,000 people. Do that arithmetic. That is every man, woman and child in Geelong riding the tram more than 120 times in a year. The system was not a relic. It was running flat out, doing the heavy lifting for a city at war. And it was carrying them to serious work. Geelong was an industrial powerhouse by now. There was the Ford motor plant up at Norlane, turning out vehicles for the war effort. There were the woolen mills, spinning cloth for uniforms. There was the Shell oil refinery, the International Harvester Works, the fertilizer plants. War work, much of it, round the clock. And the trams moved the workers, shift after shift, to the factories that kept the country going. Petrol was for tanks and aircraft, not for the daily commute. So the tram, quietly, became essential to the whole machinery of a nation at war. With the men away at the war, something else changed on the trams. Women stepped into the conductors' uniforms, working the cars, taking the fares, calling the stops. The fame story that played out across the whole country, playing out on the trams of Moorabool Street. And it was just before all this, in October of 1940, that the system reached its final extension, a new run along Bellarine Street down to the eastern beach. The very last piece of track this network would ever lay. They were still building it outward, still investing in it, on the eve of its busiest years. There is an older echo here too. Back in the First World War, Geelong had run a recruiting tram through its streets. A car done up with patriotic slogans to drum up enlistments, rolling through the city as a kind of moving call to arms. The trams had always been woven into the big moments of the city's life. The peace celebrations, where badges were sold aboard the cars. The war efforts. The daily grind. Through both world wars, the trams were there, doing the work. So here is where we stand by the mid-1940s. The system is busy. The system is needed. The system is hauling 6.5 million people a year and proving its worth every single day. And here is the cruel part. Here is the timing that should stop you cold. At the precise moment the Geelong Trams were at their busiest and most useful, at the moment they had just proved beyond any argument how much the city relied on them, they were barely a decade from total destruction. The most useful thing on the streets of Geelong was about to be marked for death, and the people who marked it had their reasons ready. Chapter 7. Run down on purpose. Here is the problem with being a tramway owned by an electricity company. The electricity company does not actually want you. The SEC was a power generation body. Its business was making and selling electricity, lighting homes, driving the state forward on the back of the brown coal of the Latrobe Valley. Running provincial tram systems was a job it had been handed, almost by accident, when it absorbed Mesco back in 1930. And running trams in Geelong and Ballarat and Bendigo was, frankly, a money loser and a distraction. So, what do you do with an asset you never wanted, and that costs you money? You have two choices. You can invest in it and make it pay, or you can let it wither, and use the withering as your excuse to get rid of it. And this is the heart of the accusation that hangs over the whole affair. The Tramway Union argued, loudly and for years, that the SEC was deliberately letting the Geelong system run down, that it refused to extend the lines into the new suburbs that were sprouting after the war, the very places where new passengers lived, that it let the cars and the track age without proper renewal, so that one day it could stand up, point at the tired old system and say, "Look how outdated this is. We simply must replace it." Run it down, then condemn it for being run down. It is one of the oldest plays in the book. The case against the trams built steadily. In 1949, a transport expert named H. Bell produced a report for the Geelong City Council. His verdict was that the trams were obsolete and could not be run profitably in a city the size of Geelong. The council swallowed it almost whole, accepting his findings by 9 votes to 1. 9 to 1. The city's own elected representatives voting to begin the end of their trams. Then, in 1953, a government report came down on the side of buses. Down at the Corio Terrace depot, the foreman and his men kept the ageing fleet running regardless, kept the butterboxes and the Pengelly cars and the bogey cars rolling out every morning, kept patching and fixing and coaxing life out of a system that the men in the offices had already decided to kill. They did their jobs. They kept the city moving. They did not yet know the date of the execution. Because the case for closure was not being discovered. It was being built, brick by brick, report by report, and all it needed now was a man with the power to sign the order. In 1955, that man arrived. Chapter 8. The Premier and the Stroke of a Pen. His name was Henry Edward Bolte, and he would become the longest-serving Premier in the history of Victoria. Bolte was a Western District farmer, a blunt, plain-spoken man with no time for sentiment and an iron faith in private enterprise. He took office in June of 1955, and he governed for 17 years, longer than any Premier Victoria has ever had. His whole creed could be boiled down to a single line he loved to repeat. "We are going to prove to the people of Australia," he said, "that fewer controls will mean greater advancement, less government, more private business." That was the Bolte way. And here is the thing you need to understand about Henry Bolte, because the trams were not a one-off. This was a man whose long reign became a byword for tearing down the old Victoria to build the new. Under his governments, Melbourne's grand Victorian heritage was carved up at a pace that horrified anyone who loved it. The National Trust, the very body set up to protect the state's history, openly bemoaned the destruction of the city's heritage on his watch. Bolte did not see old things as treasures. He saw them as obstacles. And a small, public, money-losing tramway in a provincial city was exactly the kind of obstacle he had no patience for. And the Geelong Trams, a publicly owned system losing money for a government power authority, never stood a chance against a man like that. Within weeks of taking power, in July of 1955, the Bolte government decided the trams would go. They would be replaced as soon as possible by buses. And not government buses, privately owned buses. The Premier described the Geelong Tramway, in words that should echo down the decades, as outdated and hopelessly inadequate. Outdated. Hopelessly inadequate. The very same system that the SEC's own engineers had called very good condition, with the best track and the newest cars of any country system in Victoria. The same system that had carried 6.5 million people in a single wartime year. Hopelessly inadequate, according to a man whose government had owned it for a matter of weeks. In November of 1955, after an inquiry, the state formally announced the plan. The trams of Geelong would be torn out and replaced with a privately operated bus service. Now, in fairness, there was a financial case, and we should put it on the table honestly. The SEC argued that the trams were losing around £95,000 a year. It argued that bringing the system properly up to date would cost something like £2 million, new track, new cars, the lot. Those are real figures, and they mattered. But here is what you must remember about those numbers. They came from the SEC itself, the very body that wanted out of the tram business. They were the case for the prosecution, not a neutral verdict. And the union disputed them furiously, pointing out again that the SEC had let the system decay in the first place and refused to grow it where the new passengers were. So, who do you believe? The accountants who wanted rid of the trams, or the men who drove them? What is not in dispute is what happened next. The order was given. The trams of Geelong were condemned. Decorated car number 4, the proud machine that had opened the system in 1912, was now living on borrowed time. And there was money to be made in what came next. You just have to follow the road to see who made it. Chapter 9. Who got the roads? Follow the money. It is the oldest rule in any story like this, and it works here too. When the trams came off the streets of Geelong, the routes they had run for 44 years did not vanish. People still needed to get to work, to the beach, to the football. The demand was still there. It just needed a new way to be met, and that new way was buses. Privately owned buses, running for private profit, on the very corridors the public trams had pioneered. The biggest winner was a local firm called Macquarie's. And here is a detail you could not make up if you tried. The man who founded Macquarie's buses, John Macquarie, had started out as a coach builder at the Ford plant in Geelong, ferrying his fellow workers around in his own vehicle before building it into a bus business. A Ford man, the motor car company, and the bus business, quietly inheriting the city that the trams once served. Macquarie's is still going today, still family-owned, the largest bus operator in Geelong. The trams died. The private buses thrived. They are still thriving. And Geelong was not alone. What happened here was the opening act of a national massacre. Over the next decade and a half, Australia tore out almost all of its trams. Adelaide gone in 1958, save one line. Perth, the same year. Hobart in 1960. Sydney, which had run one of the largest tram networks in the entire world, ripped the whole thing out by 1961. Brisbane followed in 1969. City after city, the same story. The same faith that the future was rubber tyres and petrol and concrete, and that the trams were yesterday's machines. And here is a detail that should make you suspicious. In Sydney, when the last tram ran, the workers moved in and paved over the tracks almost overnight, so that there could be no return of the trams, even if the buses proved inadequate. Think about that. They did not just stop running the trams, they made sure, physically, permanently, that the decision could never be reversed. The same logic that would play out in Geelong. You do not rip the rails out of the ground and cart them away if you are leaving the door open. You do it to slam the door shut forever. There have long been whispers, here and overseas, about who pushed hardest for the death of the trams. The oil companies, the tyre makers, the bus and motorcar manufacturers. The same suspicions that surround the destruction of the streetcars in American cities. Whether or not you believe the hand of big business was on every decision, the outcome was the same everywhere. The public thing that ran on rails died, and the private thing that ran on petrol took its place. But here is the part that turns the whole thing into a tragedy with a punchline. Because one city said no. Just 75 kilometres up the road from Geelong sat Melbourne. And Melbourne had a man named Sir Robert Risson running its tramways, a former Army Major General, stubborn as granite, who flatly refused to follow the fashion. When the pressure came to rip out Melbourne's trams, Risson dug in. He famously had the tracks set in concrete, partly so that tearing them out would be so expensive and so disruptive that no government would dare try. And it worked. Melbourne kept its trams. Today, Melbourne runs the largest tram network on the face of the earth, more than 250 kilometres of track. A global icon. The thing every visitor photographs. 75 kilometres apart. One city saved its trams and got a treasure that defines it to this day. The other tore its trams out and got Macquarie's buses. Geelong made its choice. Or rather, the choice was made for it by a premier in Melbourne and an electricity board that never wanted the job. And on a Sunday in March of 1956, that choice came to its end. Chapter 10. 25th of March, 1956. They did not kill the system all at once. They did it in stages, like switching off the lights in a great house, room by room, until only one was left burning. The 8th of January, 1956. The last cars ran on the east, the west, and the Chilwell routes. 3 lines, gone in a day. The 24th of January. Newtown and Eastern Park fell silent. The 4th of March. The North route closed. And then there was one. Just the Belmont line, running south across the Barwon, the last tram route in all of Geelong. It was given one final week. Its execution was set for Sunday, the 25th of March, 1956. They sent it out in a blaze of glory. Because whatever the men in the offices had decided, the people of Geelong knew exactly what they were losing, and they came out in their thousands to say goodbye. Decorated for the occasion, leading the final procession, was car number 4, the same car, the very same machine, that had carried the mayors through the cheering, ribboned streets on opening day in 1912. 44 years almost to the month. It had opened the system, and now it was chosen to close it. Behind it, ran 3 of the big bogie cars, numbers 38, 31 and 33, packed with passengers, and they sent number 4 out last, so it would be the final tram home. A huge crowd lined the route. There were ceremonies. There were speeches on the final return trip. People rode who had not ridden in years, wanting to be able to say they were there, on the last tram, on the last day. Parents lifted children onto the running boards so that one day those children could say they had ridden a Geelong tram before the trams were gone. The clang of the bell down streets that had heard it for 44 years for the very last time. And then the lights of the procession swung into the Belmont terminus, and the crowd fell quiet, and it was over. Think about what that crowd knew that the men in the offices did not. They knew you do not turn out in your thousands to farewell something that does not matter. They knew that whatever the ledgers said, whatever a premier in Melbourne had decided, they were losing a piece of their city that would never come back. You could read the loss on their faces in the photographs. The trams were outdated, the government had said. The thousands lining the road to Belmont that night clearly did not agree. At the depot, the foreman, DJ Irwin, was there at the end of it all. The man who had kept the cars running through the lean years and the condemned years was presented with an engraved conductor's bell, marking the death of the system he had served. He would go on, fittingly, to become depot foreman at Ballarat, where the trams were allowed to live. The next day, the newspaper put it in language nobody could misread. Geelong, the report said, was without a tramway system today, for the first time in over 40 years. And then they did the thing that tells you it was never going to be reconsidered. They tore up the rails. They pulled down the overhead wire. They lifted the track out of the streets and paved over the scars. There would be no second thoughts, no quiet revival, no change of heart in 10 years. The infrastructure of 44 years was ripped out of the ground and carted away. In Ballarat, the trams ran on for another 15 years. In Bendigo, 16. In Geelong, the silence had already begun. Chapter 11. The Silent Streets. Stand on Moorabool Street today and you would never know. The traffic flows down the hill toward the bay, cars and buses and delivery vans, over bitumen that gives nothing away. There are no rails. There is no wire overhead. There is not a single tram, and barely a soul in this city under the age of 80 who can remember the sound of one. Walk into the Westfield shopping centre that now stands where the system's heart once beat, and if you know exactly where to look, above an emergency exit door, you will find it. A single old sign. The letters of the Melbourne Electric Supply Company, the English firm that started it all, marooned now among the shop fronts. Down by the waterfront there is a small bollard shaped like a tram conductor, one of a line of painted figures along the promenade. That, and a few photographs in the Heritage Centre, is very nearly all that is left. An entire system. 44 years. Almost wholly erased. Lesson 1. They killed what worked. Never let anyone tell you the Geelong Trams died of old age. They did not. In 1930, the State Electricity Commission's own inspectors examined this system and called it very good condition. With track under 10 years old and rolling stock under 20, the soundest of the 3 country networks they took over. That is not folklore. That is the official record, written by the organisation that would later destroy it. And in 1943, this supposedly inadequate system carried 6.5 million passengers in a single year, in a city of 50,000. It did the work. It proved its worth beyond any argument. When a premier who had owned the system for a matter of weeks stood up and called it outdated and hopelessly inadequate, he was not describing a worn-out machine. He was describing a machine that was inconvenient to a particular idea about how the world should be run. The trams were not broken. They were in the way. Remember the difference, because you will hear that same word, outdated, used again and again in this country, every time someone wants to tear down something that works. Lesson 2. Follow who profits. When a public service is taken away, always ask the same question. Who gets the business now? In Geelong, the answer was clear. The trams were public. The buses that replaced them were private. The routes that the public tramway had built and run for 44 years were handed to private operators, chief among them McHarry's, founded by a former Ford man, who run them at a profit to this day. A public asset became a private opportunity. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is simply what happened, in the open, with the Premier's blessing. So when you hear that something old and public must go because it is losing money, ask the next question. Losing money for whom? And making money for whom once it is gone? The word outdated does a lot of convenient work in this country. It is often just a polite way of saying there is more profit in the replacement. Lesson 3. Erasure is a choice. Here is the thing that should haunt Geelong. It did not have to be this way, and the proof is just up the road. Ballarat kept its trams until 1971, and then its people saved them, and you can ride them today. Bendigo kept its until 1972, and saved them too. 75 kilometres away, Melbourne refused outright, and now owns the largest tram network on earth. 3 cities looked at the same fashion for ripping out trams, and 3 cities found another way. Geelong did not. Geelong tore its system out first, fastest, and most completely, and then lifted the very rails from the streets so there could be no going back. Heritage is not something that simply happens to a place. It is a series of choices, made by named people, in real rooms, on real dates. Henry Bolte chose. The Geelong Council chose 9 votes to 1. The SEC chose, and what they chose, between them, was erasure. Somewhere in a museum shed, far from the streets it was built to serve, car number 4 still exists. The tram that ran first and ran last. The tram that carried the mares through the ribbons in 1912 and led the silent thousands down to Belmont in 1956. It sits quiet now, its bell still, its route long since paved over. The proudest machine in Geelong's history, with nowhere left to go. The streets it once ruled have forgotten it, for now.